So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Brexit anger over shortfall in government funds to replace EU support for disadvantaged regions. Now, there is an FT article on this, which I found more confusing than the independent one. So I'm going to go off the independent article, but I'll link both because I'm a nice man. So the government fund designed to replace EU grants lost due to Brexit has been blasted as catastrophic amid claims it will cut support for disadvantaged areas by more than 40% over the coming 3 years. And I'll get into why that's the case, which is a bit confusing in the way the author has worded this. It took me a few minutes to really figure out what they were talking about. But, you know, a 40% cut in the structural funds over the next 3 years is tragic. It's really bad for these areas who are very impoverished. And also, you know, after 2024, after the election, what are the funds going to look like then? Because we don't know for sure how much the EU would have given in terms of structural funds, but it looks like on average it's about £1.5 billion a year, and that's all we know. So will the Tories just get rid of the structural funds after that? For the most part, we don't know, and you know it'll be a new election, a new mandate. We don't even know who Prime Minister will be at that point, really. You know, can I see Johnson lasting a few more years? I don't know. But the Conservative manifesto for 2019 general election promised to at least match the money provided to less wealthy areas through the EU structural support, which hasn't happened, and we'll get into why here. The details of the Shared Prosperity Fund released it was recent, by Levelling Up Secretary Michael Gove shows that it will hand out £2.6 billion over 3 years, but it will not reach the £1.5 billion annual total provided by Brussels in the year 24-25. So the way they word it, £2.6 billion over 3 years, right? They've done it in a confusing way because £1.5 billion a year is what, £4.5 billion over 3 years. So it's like it's about 40%, so just under half, really, when you think about it, which is just ridiculous because these areas do need the money. Gove said the fund will start at 400 million this year and only gradually rise to the previous EU levels because needy regions will still be receiving funds from Brussels until the end of 2024. And this is where I was confused about the anger, but ironically, it's George Osborne who actually explains it. George freaking Osborne, like George Osborne, the guy who looks like Casper's ghost. Explains it, and his wording doesn't make sense, so it took me a minute to figure it out, but I'll go over the explanation in a sec. But Northern Powerhouse Partnership, chaired by former Tory Chancellor George Osborne. You put George Osborne, the man who cut so much money to Northern England, you know, you're putting him in charge of the Northern Powerhouse Partnership, George Osborne. Okay. He said it was unfair as EU money related to projects which were already underway and would not have deducted funds from the next 2 years if the UK was still in the EU. So the way I read it is, the way it worked in the EU was even if you were allocated funds the last year, they wouldn't take that into account for this year's funding, for example. So if they gave you, say, I don't know, £10 million to your region last year, they'll give you another £10 million this year, depending on the projects that are on offer, you know, because you have to bid for the money. Now, what the UK are arguing is because the EU gave, you know, this money that was allocated, say, this year, right, they don't have to allocate new money for this year. That's the way I've kind of interpreted it, I think. So what they're saying is the EU have already allocated money, so we don't have to allocate more money when it's the case that they should, because the EU didn't give the structural funds out like this. Because if the government are arguing that the fund will start at £400 million this year and gradually rise to the previous EU levels, which you can't make that argument because we know the funds are actually less. So what they're doing is arguing that they're supplementing the EU funds to get it to that 1.5 billion figure as the structural funds kind of wear off because of Brexit. But what they're doing is they're saying, oh, you've already got money, you don't need this new funding for projects, when they do for new projects. You know, the EU didn't care for, I've already given you this much money for a project last year, why do you need more? They didn't work like that. And the Tory government are, they're saying, oh, you've already got money from, you know, this last year's project because it's still ongoing, so you don't need more new money. That's the way I've kind of read it. They've said, like, you've got money for ongoing projects, so you don't need more, when the EU fund does, oh, you've got money for an ongoing project, but you want to do a new project. Here's some more money for the new project. Does that make sense? If it doesn't, I'll try and explain it in a pinned comment. Welsh First Minister Mark Drakeford said the nation stands to lose out by £1 billion over 3 years while having less say over how the money is spent. And so for the argument that they've replaced the EU structural funds, it's a myth. He said this is not levelling up, it's levelling down. It's like when Super Mario has a mushroom and then he gets hit by someone, probably Bowser or one of those little turtles. You level down, you go smaller. That's what's happened here. The NPP director Henry Murison said the shortfall amounted to a 43% cut over 3 years, while authorities will lose the long-term security provided by the 7-year allocations offered by the EU. So if you can do a long-term project, say something to do with animal conservation, rather than being funded year on year, they'll give you a 7-year remit until the next set of budget allocation for the EU happens, which makes sense because some of these projects are incredibly long-term. So the EU structure is a lot better. He says, we were promised that no nation would be worse off post-Brexit, but when you take out the smoke and mirrors, the data doesn't lie, especially when the funds are 43% lower, so the government can't argue they've actually replaced the former EU funds when they haven't. These funds helped young people find work, which is something the Tories refuse to really do, supported small businesses, which again is something the Tories refuse to do, backed medical research, which the Tories kind of do, or did with the vaccine, but not much else. Cutting it will have catastrophic consequences for our economy, and if you're damaging small businesses and also doing things to reduce the help for young people to get work, you're asking for a double spiral of negativity at that point. Announcing how money from the fund will be shared over the next 3 years, Gove said it would help to unleash the creativity and talent in the communities that have been overlooked and undervalued, yet you're privatising Channel 4, which does help out certain northern areas because they're based up in the north now. So that doesn't make sense. You're also, cutting support to small businesses and young people trying to help find work. How is that going to unleash creativity? You found creative solutions to damage these people, sure, but that's not what you're talking about, is it? We've taken back control of our money, even though it's just as bureaucratic as before, and now you're going to go to more pork barrel politics, aiming money at swing seats. And we are empowering those who know their communities best to deliver their priorities when that money was already allocated via communities anyways. The NPP said the post-Brexit fund was worth an average £873 million annually over the next 3 years, compared to the £1.5 billion a year from the EU between 2014 and 2020, and was being delivered in a way which encouraged short-termism. And I think next time out, if we are still part of the EU during the next budget allocation, I think the UK would have received more than £1.5 billion a year on average from the EU structural funds. Because of the amount of impoverishment the Tories have done. So again, we've lost out even more, really. This would mean, for example, the Tees Valley receiving £13 million less and Greater Manchester receiving £23 million less, allowing for inflation, they said. And the simple fact is, these people argue they knew what they voted for till the cows come home, but the simple fact is, if this is what you voted for, then you voted to make yourself and your area more poor and worse. Is that really what you wanted? Is that what you voted for in 2016? Because there are people who said, I voted Brexit to make your lives better, the future generation, when you've just made it worse, pal. So it's very frustrating. Mr. Drakeford said, despite repeated promises, the UK government's announcement today leaves Wales with less money, less say over less money. So clearly the bureaucracy has gotten worse. Also the fact that, Wales typically votes Labour. So, you're going to see a lot less money going to Labour constituencies. He says we'll lose over £1 billion that could have been used to grow the economy and support our most disadvantaged communities. This isn't levelling up, this is levelling down, which I 100% agree with Mark Drakeford. You got Labour Shadow Levelling Up Secretary Lisa Nandy, who probably going to hear of more during the week because Gove recently announced this Level Up stuff. Said the announcement amounted to another broken promise from the government because they don't care about the north of England. When are people in the north going to realise that? They don't care about you. We don't have full figures, this is at least Nandy speaking, we don't have full figures as the government haven't published them, but the direction of travel is obvious and frustratingly familiar, she said. Big promises to level up, all this blind optimism and all this nonsense. She didn't say that, I say that. Don't mean much when you're cutting money from our most disadvantaged communities, and as people point out, money spent in an impoverished area goes far further than spending it in a richer area. That money it can do way more help than it can if you spend money in Sunak's constituency, for example. Meanwhile, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the IFS, think tank said that government had missed an opportunity to get rid of arbitrary features in EU schemes which create cliff edge disparities in funding. They say, with far greater levels of support going to Cornwall and West Wales than other areas which are only marginally wealthier, like South Yorkshire, Lincolnshire and Durham. So it could have been, maybe is that something for the EU to look at when it comes to tweaking the structural funds, that rather than just focusing absolutely on purely impoverished areas, they'd look at areas where the disparities are fairly similar, maybe not as bad but fairly similar, and look at helping those areas as well in other EU member states. Maybe that's something the EU can look at in future, or maybe they are looking at it when it comes to the structural funds. I don't know. The government has taken back control only to stick to an arbitrary, poorly designed, out-of-date funding allocation mechanism, said the IFS's David Phillips and Ben Zaranko. It's a cool second name. And maybe that's something for the EU to look at. Maybe they can make adjustments to the structural funds allocations, but no doubt they'll do better than the UK, because we're going to see a ton of pork barrel politics. Gove said the fund could be used to regenerate run-down high streets, fight antisocial behaviour and crime, and help more people into decent jobs, which is definitely not going to happen. Labour say they do have plans for helping high streets by cutting business rates, and I think taxing internet companies more, which is fine, but they don't talk about it nearly enough. But the high streets are not doing great, and the high streets do generate a lot of jobs. Fight antisocial behaviour and crime. The Tories can do that by funding the police properly and also the judiciary. We've seen, before the pandemic, that the wait times for court dates were astronomically high because they cut the amount of judge sitting days. They've cut the amount of courts, amongst other things. The Level Up Fund was never going to make up for the sins of Theresa May or Boris Johnson or David Cameron. It was never going to bridge that gap of over a decade of austerity. Local authorities will be required to submit an investment plan setting out how they intend to use it. So, do you vote Tory? Yes. Are you in a swing seat? Yes. Here's some money, which will then have to be agreed with the government to unlock the funds. The government has said the funds will match EU funding in real terms, and then with each area, an index of need will be used to allocate the funds to each local authority, which is just ridiculous. Like, it's just straight lies on it. They argue that the fund will match EU funding in real terms. Well, clearly you don't exist within reality, because the funding amounts you're giving over the next few years are lower than what the EU are giving, and clearly you are saying to certain areas you've already got EU funding, so you're not eligible for new funding. We can already see through EU structural funds we got 1.5 billion a year. The government offering 2.6 billion over the next 3 years, which is less, and they're going to struggle to claim that they're making up for the shortfall. Gove said the fund will start at 400 million. They did mention further down here how much the allocation is during the first year, if I can find it. So there it is, an average of 473 plus 400 million, right? It's still less than the 1.5 billion we received from the EU. So even if you add in the amount that Gove is saying is on the table, 873 plus 4 takes us to what, 112? What's that? Yeah. What's that? 1,000, a billion, 1.2 billion, which is less than the 1.5 billion that we received from the EU. Sorry, my maths isn't the best, doing it on the fly. Sort of scripting probably would help, but you can see here 400 million. Sorry, this is the average, but it's still less. It's still less than what the EU are offering, which is just ridiculous. They're offering an average of 873 when the EU are offering an average of 1.5, and I think during the next budget allocation that number would have gone up. But anyways, look, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Support the channel on Patreon if you can. And hopefully I'll see you in the next one.